Here in Concept 51.3, we're going to move away from the how. So for the most part, we've been talking about the how with the first two questions that we mentioned. And now we're going to move toward the why. So we're going to move away from the physiology of the behavior to the benefits to the species of a particular behavior. And we'll start with that question number 3. How does the behavior aid survival and reproduction? The why. The why does the creature behave this way, or why does the creature do this? How is it beneficial? How does it assist them? How does it tie into evolution, natural selection, that type of thing? So Concept 51.3 says selection for individual survival and reproductive success can explain most behaviors. And of course, behaviors can enhance survival and reproductive success in a population, just like certain physical traits can enhance survival and reproductive success in a population. So that's what we'll take a look at next. One of the most basic, important types of behavior is the finding and gathering of food. Natural selection refines behaviors that enhance the efficiency of feeding. You want to expend as little energy as possible and take in as many calories as possible. We call this foraging behavior. Foraging is food obtaining behavior, and that includes recognizing, searching for, hunting, capturing, and eating food items. You want to be as good at that as possible. Evolution of foraging behavior, one of the ways we can look at this is using the classic fruit fly, which is used in so many different biological studies and biological experiments. We found that in this fruit fly, it's one particular gene, the variation in one particular gene, that will dictate the foraging habits of the little baby fruit flies, the larvae, the maggots basically. Larvae with one particular allele of that gene will travel farther while foraging than larvae with the other allele. So what's interesting is we have, in fruit flies at least, we have gotten it down to one particular gene that affects how far the larva will travel to find food. And if they have one allele, they tend not to travel very far, and if they have the other variation, the other allele, they tend to travel out farther. And you might think, well, why would they have these two different behaviors? What would be the benefit of these two possibilities? Well, in a high density population where there's a whole bunch of larvae all in one spot, it would be beneficial if you were the type that traveled further out to find food. In a low density population, it would be more beneficial not to waste that energy and find the food and use the food that was more nearby. So depending on your condition, depending on the environment, one of these alleles will be advantageous over the other, but it does depend on the environment. Natural selection favors different alleles depending on the density of the population. So under laboratory conditions, evolutionary changes in the frequency of these two alleles were observed over several generations. And you can see, depending on the environmental conditions, certain populations were preferred, certain alleles were preferred. Over time, in low population densities, the orange ones, the trait for the behavior for not traveling very far started to win out. And in high density populations, the trait for traveling further afield was the allele that won out. So you can see there's these two different behaviors, and both of them can be beneficial, but it depends on the environmental conditions. And so there's two alleles in this one gene that affect this particular trait, this particular behavior. So just like different body physical traits can be affected, so can behavioral traits. We talked about how this is really an energy efficiency experiment. In any creature, you want to expend as little energy as possible to get in as many calories and as much energy as possible. We call this the optimal foraging model, and it views foraging behavior as this compromise, this cost-benefit analysis between the cost of obtaining food versus the benefit of the nutrition that you're going to gain. And the cost of obtaining the food includes the energy expenditure and the risk of being eaten while you're foraging. When you're out and about searching for food, you're also exposing yourself to danger. And so that is part of this cost-benefit analysis that animals go through. Natural selection should favor foraging behavior that minimizes the cost, maximizes the benefit, and that's pretty much what we see over time. Optimal foraging behavior is demonstrated by the northwestern crow. In the book, they use this great example of this type of bird who will eat a particular type of mollusk called a whelk. And so it has a shell, and inside the shell is this little soft body that the bird wants to get to, but it can't just pry open the shell or break it with its beak. So what he does is he gets one of these shelled creatures, this mollusk, and he flies up high in the air and he drops it onto some rocks from a particular height. And then of course he'll fly down once it's cracked open and he'll eat the soft insides of the mollusk. Now the crow faces this trade-off between how far up should he fly and drop it, and how many times is he going to have to drop it versus the food that he's going to get when he does finally crack it open. There's energy expended in flying too high or having to drop it over and over and over again, so they would want to be the most efficient. They would want to find the height that gives them the greatest chance of cracking it open on the first try, but not overexerting energy and flying way too high and having to waste that energy. So what researchers did is they took some of these mollusks and they tested them in the lab to see what would be the optimal height to drop them at, where you would get the most advantage, the most efficiency, and that turned out to be about 5 meters. So this was a human doing testing, dropping these creatures onto the rocks, seeing when their shell broke, and they tested it at about the optimal, most efficient height of 5 meters. Then they went out and they did some measurements, took measurements and watched the actual wild birds, and it turns out the wild birds drop at about 5.23 meters. So amazingly, the birds are very efficient. They pretty much fall in line with what the most efficient humans found was the optimal foraging model. Here's the chart that kind of shows that information. So here they're comparing the average number of drops with the drop height. You notice if you don't get it up high enough, you have to drop it over and over and over again. And if you fly too high, yes, you don't have to drop it very often, but your total flight height, the total energy expended, goes up and up and up. So the most efficient was right about 5, and that's about right where the crows tend to do it for the most part. That's the preferred height. So they are quite efficient in their use of energy in finding and obtaining that food. As I mentioned, the other thing that the creatures have to watch out for is the risk of predators. When they're out and about and feeding, they have to balance the reward of food with the risk of being killed by another creature. And a good example used in the textbook is mule deer. And there they are right there. They look slightly like the white-tailed deer that we have all over here in East Texas. Mule deer are more likely to feed in open forested areas where they are less likely to be killed by mountain lions. So even though mule deer can actually find enough food in heavily wooded areas as well as open areas, they will actually go to the more open areas that have slightly less food because it gives them a greater advantage over the mountain lions. So some creatures will give up food or give up certain things in exchange for a slight bit of protection, and that's what they're doing here. They're balancing the risk of being attacked with the amount of food that they can find. And again, they're trying to find the most efficient balancing point between those two. So foraging behavior and finding food and the various behaviors that are related to that are always being tweaked by natural selection to try to be as efficient as possible. And then of course the other thing that we mentioned was, in addition to food, which is equal to survival, the other thing that all animals want is sex, to reproduce, to create more of themselves. So there are quite a few mating behaviors and mating choices that go into this efficiency that we talked about and the various behaviors that we see. A lot of what drives the behaviors of many creatures is this desire to find a mate and to reproduce. And mating behavior would include seeking or attracting mates, choosing potential mates, competing for mates, caring for offspring. Everything involved in finding a mate and then reproducing involves these various behaviors. Mating relationships define a number of distinct mating systems, and you can find a wide variety of mating systems within the animal kingdom. So one of the ones we're going to look at would be whether or not they stay with a particular mate or they do not stay with a particular mate, and that varies quite a bit from species to species. Some species are what we might call promiscuous, with no strong pair bonds or lasting relationships. They simply mate. Basically, you might say freely with each other. They don't really form bonds, or they don't really form pairs that stay together for very long, and the mating is kind of a freewheeling process here and there, and that would be considered promiscuous. In a monogamous relationship, that would be at the other end of the spectrum. One male mates with one female and tends to develop some sort of relationship or pair bonding with that particular mate. There is a wide variety between those two, but that's kind of the two ends of the spectrum. One thing that's been noted by scientists is that in monogamous relationships, among animals that have monogamous relationships, oftentimes the males and females, they have similar external morphologies with little sexual dimorphism. In other words, they look a lot alike. It can be difficult to tell them apart, say from 20 feet away. And so in creatures that are monogamous, oftentimes their body shape and size tends to be more alike between the males and the females. For example, in these seagulls are monogamous. They tend to mate with one particular male or female and stay with that one particular male and female. And you can see here's a male and female, and it's almost impossible to tell them apart. They're pretty much the same size, same shape. They don't have a lot of distinguishing characteristics that would immediately tell you it's male or female. You would have to inspect them closer to know that. Now you can kind of compare that to other types of mating situations. So we could talk about a polygamous relationship. A polygamous relationship is where an individual of one sex mates with a number of individuals of the other sex. So species with polygamous mating systems are usually sexually dimorphic. In other words, the males and females do not look exactly alike. One of them is going to be bigger than the other, or flashier, or more colorful, or something like that. So polygamous relationships can be one male and multiple females, or in some cases one female and multiple males. Polygamous relationships can either be polygynous or polyandrous. I think I've got the pronunciation of those right. Polygynous or polyandrous. So polygamous relationships can either be polygynous or polyandrous. In polygyny, which tends to be more common in the animal kingdom, one male mates with many females, and the males are usually larger, more showy. They have ornamentation or horns or something like that. So a good example is in the elk here. They tend to have one large male that stays with and kind of protects and lords over a number of females here. So this would be a polygynous species. And you can see that the male tends to be larger, more muscular, has the antlers. In birds, they would be more showy and more colorful, things of that nature. Probably more common in the animal world is this particular type of polygamy, where it's one male with multiple females. Now the flip side of that, or the reverse of that, would be polyandry. Polyandry is when one female mates with many males, and in this case it's just the opposite. The females tend to be the more showy ones, the flashier looking ones, sometimes even the larger ones. Here's a particular water bird where the female is this more kind of brightly colored one that you see here, and the male is down below here. So there can be the opposite of what you oftentimes think of, where you have the female mating with many males, and that would be polyandry. In both cases, you see some sexual dimorphism usually. In monogamous relationships, you tend to not see that sexual dimorphism, the differences quite as much. Of course, after mating does occur, you have caring for the offspring, and that is part of the whole reproductive process. It doesn't really do you much good to mate if none of the offspring survive. So the needs of the young are also an important factor that kind of constrain the evolution of various mating systems. For example, you could compare two different types of birds, where one in which the baby chicks are very needy and they are not able to live on their own for quite a long time, and they need a continuous supply of food. Well, in that case, a male bird maximizes his reproductive success by staying with his mate and caring for his chicks, and that would be monogamy. So you have the male bird kind of taking on the duties of a parent along with the female and helping make sure those chicks survive. The flip side of that would be a bird species where the chicks are able to be out on their own very soon. They're able to feed and care for themselves very, very quickly. Well, in that case, the male is better off maximizing his reproductive success by seeking additional mates, polygyny. So he will breed with the one female and then go off to find and breed with another female, because for the most part the chicks take care of themselves. So you have two different variations of mating patterns based on taking care of or ensuring that the babies are able to survive and go on to adulthood. The other major factor in paternity is that animals are trying to be as efficient as possible with their energy use, and they tend not to want to waste time to raise offspring that they're not sure is theirs. So you have this certainty of paternity that influences the amount of parental care and the mating behavior of particular creatures. Females, of course, tend to be very maternal and take care of their offspring because they can be certain that the eggs laid or the young born contain their genes, but male paternal certainty depends on the mating behavior, and the males in certain cases can't always be sure that the offspring are theirs, so you might see some behavioral differences there. Paternal certainty is relatively low in species with internal fertilization because mating and birth are separated over time. So if there's a type of creature where fertilization occurs and it's internal fertilization and the pregnancy is internal, you tend to see less exclusively male parental care in these species, because the male can't be sure that the offspring is actually his, or is less likely to be sure that the offspring is his. And you can contrast that with egg laying or external fertilization, where the certainty of paternity is much higher because the egg laying and the mating occur together. Like, for example, frogs or something like that, where it's external fertilization, where the egg laying and the mating occur at the same time. Well, there's a high likelihood of the male having paternity certainty and knowing that those offspring are containing his genetic line. In these species, parental care is at least as likely to be by the males as by the females. So you get a lot of male care in these species, a higher percentage of male parental care in these species, because the paternal certainty is higher as well. And again, it goes back to animals basically not wanting to waste energy caring for or raising offspring that doesn't contain their genetic line. A good example of male paternal care is by this male jawfish here. He actually holds the fertilized eggs in his mouth until they fully develop and hatch. And you don't see this in all species, but because external fertilization occurs with these fish, the female fish lays the eggs and the male fertilizes them with his sperm at the same time. Well, there's a benefit for this male fish to help take care of these babies, because he can be pretty much certain that they are his offspring, that they contain his genetic line, and he is moving forward his genetic line. In past chapters, we already talked about sexual dimorphism and how the males and females often look different, and some of the traits of those physical traits of those creatures, like, for example, the flashy feathers of a male peacock. And we talked about sexual selection, which is how the females, the choosing of the females and the preference for certain physical traits drives natural selection, or a type of natural selection called sexual selection, which is a form of natural selection. And that's where you develop that sexual dimorphism. In intersexual selection, members of one sex choose mates on the basis of certain traits, and in intrasexual selection, that involves competition between members of the same sex for mates. So just as we talked about with physical traits, and we'll talk about that more in just a second, there's also behaviors that are selected for via potential mates as well. So sexual selection affects physical traits as well as behaviors. What we most commonly see is mate choice by females, and female choice is a type of intersexual competition. Females can drive sexual selection by preferring or choosing males that have specific behaviors or features of their anatomy. And some examples I give in the textbook are this particular funny looking fly called a stalk-eyed fly, and the females tend to choose the males that have the longer eye stalks. So ornaments such as long eye stalks often correlate with health and vitality. If you have basically enough health and strength to carry around these large eye stalks, or you're good enough at finding food to have a healthy, strong body, well, then that bodes well for being able to reproduce quality offspring. So, for example, if you think about a peacock, a large peacock with very flashy, beautiful feathers, that means that male peacock is probably getting enough food, and obviously he's been able to escape predators. So it's a sign to the female that this is a strong, healthy potential mate, and it would provide strong, healthy children. So oftentimes these traits, the behaviors of the bowerbird or the anatomical traits like the beautiful feathers of the peacock. They are signals to the females that this would make a good mate, that this would provide a good genetic basis for my offspring. So here you have these stalk-eyed flies, and the two males will face off and they'll kind of battle each other. For the most part, it's all show. They don't really damage each other. The male fly that usually has the smaller stalks tends to be the one that concedes and goes off to the corner and cry because he lost. But oftentimes it's all these battles between males. Sometimes they do result in actual damage and death, but oftentimes they're kind of just for show, showing off, puffing up their chest. Another example of mate choice by females occurs in zebra finches, pretty little birds that you can actually buy as a pet. Female chicks who imprint on ornamented fathers are more likely to select ornamented mates. So what this means is the fathers have an effect on what the females later on choose in life. So if you're a baby little female finch and your dad has particular ornamental feathers, you are more likely to choose that type of mate when you grow up to then choose a mate of your own. Experiments suggest that mate choice by female zebra finches has played a key role in the evolution of ornamentation in male zebra finches. So here they are, cute little birds. There's a male, the more colorful one, and the female one in the foreground. And the experiment showed that it didn't matter if the mom had the ornamentation, kind of the bright, odd-looking feathers. It only mattered if the dad did. And whatever the dad had, the female chicks would kind of imprint on, okay, that's what a dad is supposed to look like. And later on, as adults, that would be the mate that they preferred, would be the one that kind of looked like dad or had the ornamentation like dad, which is kind of odd. You would think that either parent would have that effect, but it was only the males that affected their later offspring male choice. Another interesting aspect of mate choice that we see in the animal kingdom that could potentially correlate to the human world as well is mate choice copying. This is a behavior in which individuals copy the mate choice of others. So, for example, they did some experiments with guppies, little bitty fish, and if there were no other females around, the females would pick a particular type coloration of fish, and they tended to pick the one that had the most coloration. So in the control, the female guppies preferred males with more orange coloration. They tended to pick the ones that were more colored. But they were also influenced by the choices of other female guppies. If the experimenters put in various models, so little fake fish that seemed to like the less colorful males, then the females would start to choose the less colorful males. So they have this odd sort of peer pressure to where they kind of give in and they start to choose a mate based on what other females chose. So think about this in human terms. Think about peer pressure, and perhaps in comedies, various romantic comedies, or maybe in your own life, you've asked yourself, how come, if you're a guy or a girl for that matter, how come no girl wants to be with you until suddenly you have a steady boyfriend or girlfriend, and then suddenly you have girls asking you out or showing interest in you? That's kind of the funny thing that seems to occur even in humans, is that your desirability goes up once you're already steady with another boyfriend or girlfriend, committed with a boyfriend or girlfriend. And it may have something to do with this kind of mate choice copying behavior that we see in animals as well. Of course, we can't talk about sexual selection and behaviors related to reproduction in the animal kingdom in particular, but also even in the human world, without talking about male competition for mates. Male competition for mates is a source of intersexual selection that can reduce the variation among males. Such competition usually involves antagonistic behavior, oftentimes very ritualized contests. Sometimes there's actual fighting and damage and physical danger, but a lot of it tends to be more ritualistic and more kind of for show. Oftentimes the fight ends before there's any major damage, and this fight or this kind of mock competition kind of determines who gains access to the females or gains access to reproduction possibilities. So here you have this antagonistic relationship between these two male kangaroos. They claw at each other and they box each other, and sometimes it does result in the damage or death of one of the creatures, but oftentimes it ends well before that point. Couple of videos there that I'll put in the notes folder of antagonistic behavior between chimps, snakes, wolves, all good examples of various types of behavior that are related to reproduction, choosing, selecting, securing a mate. One last little offshoot of this mate selection behavior and process to consider and to talk about is the fact that in some species, sexual selection has driven the evolution of various alternative mating behaviors and morphologies. In most, it tends to drive toward males that are the biggest, the strongest, the flashiest, or whatever. But there are many cases where in certain populations or in certain species, you'll have kind of multiple variations of males, and the fitness of one particular phenotype, behavior, or morphology kind of depends on the phenotypes of the other individuals in the population. And so what is best depends on whatever else is around, is basically what we're saying. And there's this idea that's actually an idea in economics called game theory, and it evaluates alternative strategies where the outcome depends on each individual strategy and the strategy of the other individuals. So if you have, say, 2 or 3 different varieties of behavior or morphology, well, which one is best? Well, that depends on the situation, is what we're saying. A great example is this type of lizard called a side-blotched lizard, and you can see there's 3 different males here. These are all males, but they tend to have a slightly different color and they have slightly different behavior. There's an orange-throated and a blue-throated and kind of a white or no color throated. When the orange-throated males tend to be the most aggressive, and they defend large territories and they attack males more often. The blue-throated ones defend smaller territories, and the yellow-throated are non-territorial, and they actually often mimic females, and when they breed, they sneak in, they breed, and they're out again. They don't hang around, they don't bother fighting, but when these guys are occupied, they will run in and breed with the females, get their job done, and then they take off. So which one would you want to be? Do you want to be an orange-throated, a blue-throated, or a yellow-throated? Well, it depends on the situation. In different populations, these guys all have differing variety or amounts or percentages that are beneficial. So that's what we call game theory. We talk about how the benefit of being any one of these particular types of males really depends on the environment and the situation and the decisions that others are making. And a great example analogy would be the rock, paper, scissors game, where each strategy will outcompete one strategy but not be outcompeted by the other. So, for example, in certain situations, it's helpful to be the orange lizard, and that will top one of the others, but not, for example, the yellow. So the orange may beat up on and chase out the blue, but the yellow ones tend to sneak in while the orange is occupied fighting off the blue. So just like in rock, paper, scissors, where scissors beats paper but rock beats scissors, the success of the game, your overall success in the game, depends on a combination of all of these and how they are employed by your opponent. That's what we call game strategy. And even in reproductive success in the animal kingdom, we sometimes see that it's not always the biggest, strongest, flashiest male that gets to breed. There can sometimes be variations, and those variations can be successful depending on the situation. We're going to take a break right there. I think we're down to our last concept, concept 51.4, and that is going to answer our last, fourth, final question: what is the behavior's evolutionary history? So when we come back, we'll hit evolution, natural selection, and how those have shaped the behaviors that we see.